The Honda Civic pulled into the Pinewood Diner parking lot with the quiet hum of a car that had seen better days but still ran faithfully. Margaret Chen stepped out slowly, adjusting her cream-colored cardigan against the afternoon breeze that swept down from the Oregon mountains. At 67, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it truly mattered. The rumble of motorcycle engines grew louder as 5 Harley-Davidsons roared into the lot, their chrome gleaming in the Saturday sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The riders dismounted with theatrical swagger, leather jackets emblazoned with Iron Wolves MC patches, their laughter carrying an edge that made other customers glance nervously toward their cars. Jake Morrison, known to his crew as Razor, spotted the elderly woman immediately. His lips curved into a predatory grin as he nudged his companions, pointing toward Maggie as she walked toward the diner entrance. What happened next would be captured on camera, shared across social media, and ultimately become the most expensive mistake these bikers ever made. Because the quiet grandmother in the cardigan wasn't just someone's sweet old lady. She was a ghost from the Navy's most classified operations, a warrior who had spent 25 years in service that officially never existed, and someone who had survived missions that would make these weekend riders question everything they thought they knew about strength. Stay with me to discover what these bikers unleashed when they decided to mess with the wrong grandmother, and why their viral video became a masterclass in the difference between looking tough and being lethal. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Pinewood Diner, a weathered establishment that had served travelers along Highway 26 for nearly 4 decades. The smell of coffee and grilled onions drifted from the kitchen vents, mixing with the scent of pine trees that bordered the property on 3 sides. It was the kind of place where truckers grabbed quick meals, families stopped during weekend trips to Mount Hood, and locals gathered to catch up on town gossip over bottomless cups of coffee. Margaret Chen had been making this drive every Saturday for the past 3 years, ever since her husband Robert had passed away and left her rattling around their empty house in Welch's. The weekly trip to Portland to visit her grandchildren had become her anchor, a routine that gave structure to days that otherwise stretched endlessly before her. She always stopped at Pinewood Diner for coffee and a slice of Betty's famous apple pie, sitting in the same corner booth where she could watch the comings and goings of Highway 26. Today felt different from the moment she pulled into the parking lot. The usual mix of family sedans and pickup trucks had been joined by 5 motorcycles, their chrome and black paint jobs gleaming aggressively in the afternoon light. The bikes were parked in a deliberate line near the diner's front entrance, taking up more space than necessary and positioned to force other customers to walk around them. Maggie turned off her Civic's engine and sat for a moment, observing the scene through her windshield. The bikers were clustered near the diner's outdoor seating area, their voices carrying across the lot with the kind of artificial volume that demanded attention. She recognized the behavior immediately, though not from her years of quiet retirement in Oregon. The posturing, the territorial display, the need to project dominance over a space they had just entered. It was textbook intimidation tactics, the kind she had studied and countered in environments far more dangerous than a roadside diner. The leader was easy to identify. Jake Morrison stood at the center of the group, his broad shoulders filling out a leather jacket that had been carefully distressed to look authentic. His beard was precisely trimmed, his jeans artfully faded, and his boots polished to a shine that suggested more time in front of a mirror than on a motorcycle. He gestured expansively as he spoke, his movements calculated to draw the eye and establish his dominance over both his crew and the space they occupied. Blake Williams, known as Viper to the club, had his phone out almost immediately, panning it across the parking lot as he live-streamed to his Instagram followers. His commentary was peppered with references to their territorial conquest of the diner, their plans to claim the best table, and his hopes that something interesting would happen to boost their engagement numbers. The Iron Wolves MC was more of a social media experiment than a genuine motorcycle club, a collection of men in their 20s and 30s who had decided that the outlaw aesthetic would translate well to viral content. Tommy Rodriguez, nicknamed Tank for his compact but muscular build, was the group's designated enforcer, though his primary qualification seemed to be an eagerness to escalate any situation that might make for compelling video content. He prowled the edges of their formation, his eyes scanning for targets of opportunity, someone they could hassle for the cameras without serious consequences. Derek Anderson, the newest member known as Clutch, bounced nervously on the balls of his feet, clearly anxious to prove himself worthy of the group's acceptance. His jacket was newer than the others, his swagger slightly forced, and his glances toward Jake suggested someone still learning the unwritten rules of their particular brand of manufactured rebellion. Mike Brooks, called Diesel, was the only member of the group who had actually spent significant time on motorcycles before joining the Iron Wolves. At 39, he was the oldest of the crew, and something in his bearing suggested actual experience rather than weekend warrior cosplay. He stood slightly apart from the others, his attention focused more on genuinely assessing their environment than on performing for social media. Maggie gathered her purse from the passenger seat, checking automatically that her phone was charged, and her keys were easily accessible. The movements were subtle, practiced, the kind of situational awareness that had become second nature during decades of training that had never quite left her system. She stepped out of her car slowly, using the motion to continue her assessment of the group near the diner entrance. The parking lot held perhaps a dozen other vehicles. A family from California was loading their kids back into an SUV after what appeared to be a successful lunch stop, the parents moving with the slightly hurried efficiency of people who wanted to avoid any potential confrontation. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap sat in the driver's seat of a pickup truck, his engine running as he watched the bikers, with the careful attention of someone who had learned to recognize trouble before it fully developed. Inside the diner, Maggie could see the usual Saturday afternoon crowd through the large windows that faced the parking lot. Betty Collins, the owner and head cook, was visible behind the service counter, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she managed the controlled chaos of weekend lunch service. Two waitresses moved between tables, their practiced efficiency keeping coffee cups filled and orders flowing smoothly, despite the increased tension that had entered their normally peaceful establishment. As Maggie walked toward the diner entrance, her pace unhurried and her expression neutral, she became aware that the biker's attention had shifted in her direction. The change was subtle at first, a slight reorientation of the group's body language, but it quickly became more pronounced as Jake Morrison's voice rose above the general conversation. The laughter that followed his comment carried an edge that made Maggie's internal alert system engage for the first time in months. It was not the good-natured humor of people enjoying themselves, but something darker, the kind of amusement that came at someone else's expense. She continued walking, her expression unchanged, but her awareness expanded to include escape routes, potential weapons, and the precise location of every member of the group. Blake had turned his phone's camera toward her now, his live stream commentary shifting to focus on what he described as entertainment value, walking straight toward them. His followers were already engaging with laughing emojis and comments encouraging him to create content with the elderly woman who had just become their unwitting target. The outdoor seating area of the diner consisted of 4 picnic tables positioned on a concrete pad between the building and the parking lot. It was here that the bikers had established their command post, spreading themselves across 2 tables and positioning their bodies to create a natural checkpoint that anyone entering the diner would have to navigate. The arrangement was deliberate, designed to force interaction and create opportunities for the kind of confrontation that would translate well to social media engagement. Maggie approached the entrance at the same steady pace she had maintained since leaving her car. Her cardigan was buttoned against the mountain breeze, her sensible shoes making no sound on the concrete, and her gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that suggested someone who valued practicality over style. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a grandmother heading in for coffee and pie. Completely unremarkable, except for her unfortunate timing. Jake Morrison stepped slightly into her path as she neared the door, not blocking her way entirely, but forcing her to acknowledge his presence. His grin was wide and predatory, the expression of someone who had found easy entertainment and intended to make the most of it. His crew arranged themselves behind him, phones out, ready to capture whatever happened next for their various social media platforms. The first comment was delivered with the tone of someone offering helpful advice to a confused elderly person. Jake suggested that perhaps she had taken a wrong turn, that this might not be the kind of establishment she was looking for, that maybe she would be more comfortable somewhere with a senior discount and softer music. His words were chosen carefully, designed to sound almost reasonable, while carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of threat. Maggie stopped walking and looked at him directly for the first time. Her expression remained neutral, polite even, as she thanked him for his concern but explained that she had been coming to this diner every Saturday for 3 years. Her voice was steady, carrying no trace of fear or defensiveness, simply the calm response of someone addressing a minor social interaction. The response seemed to frustrate Jake, who had clearly expected either immediate submission or defensive anger that would make for better video content. He exchanged glances with his crew, then escalated his approach, suggesting that regular customers deserved a certain level of respect, that perhaps she could demonstrate her appreciation for their tolerance of her presence. It was then that Blake's live stream audience began to engage more aggressively, their comments encouraging increasingly inappropriate behavior toward what they perceived as an easy target. The suggestions ranged from harmless pranks to scenarios that crossed the line into harassment, and Blake read several of them aloud, his tone suggesting that he was taking requests for how to proceed. Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward, emboldened by the audience engagement, and eager to establish his role as the group's enforcer. His suggestion that Maggie might want to buy them all coffee as a gesture of goodwill was delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of expression that transformed a request into a demand through tone alone. Derek Anderson, still trying to prove himself worthy of inclusion in the group, added his own contribution to the escalating situation. His comment about teaching respect to people who didn't understand their place was punctuated by a step closer to Maggie, his body language shifting from casual intimidation to something more overtly threatening. Throughout this exchange, Maggie's expression never changed. She listened to each comment with the same polite attention she might give to a cashier reciting the daily specials, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture suggesting someone who was mildly inconvenienced rather than threatened. When Tommy finished his demand for coffee purchases, she nodded thoughtfully and explained that she would be happy to buy coffee for anyone who needed it, but that she generally preferred to handle such transactions inside the establishment. The response clearly wasn't what the bikers had expected. Her complete lack of fear or defensiveness seemed to deflate their momentum temporarily, forcing them to reassess their approach. Jake Morrison's expression shifted from predatory amusement to something closer to confusion, while Blake's livestream audience began commenting on the unexpected development of their target, showing no reaction to intimidation. It was Mike Brooks who first noticed that something was wrong with their assessment of the situation. From his position slightly apart from the main group, he had a better angle to observe Maggie's overall demeanor, and what he saw didn't match the narrative his teammates were constructing. Her stillness wasn't the paralysis of fear, but something else entirely, a quality of readiness that he recognized from his own military service years earlier. The way she stood was subtly wrong for a frightened elderly woman. Her feet were positioned slightly apart, her weight balanced evenly, and her hands, while appearing relaxed, were positioned where they could move quickly if needed. Most tellingly, her eyes had begun a systematic assessment of each member of the group, cataloging their positions, their apparent physical capabilities, and their preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Likely responses to various scenarios. Mike opened his mouth to suggest that perhaps they should let the lady pass and find their entertainment elsewhere, but his words were drowned out by Jake Morrison's decision to escalate the situation further. Frustrated by Maggie's failure to provide the kind of reaction that would make for compelling content, Jake stepped directly into her path and delivered what he clearly intended to be the confrontation's climactic moment. His suggestion that she demonstrate her respect through a more tangible gesture, accompanied by a crude comment about the entertainment value of elderly people trying to appear defiant, finally triggered the response that would change everything. Not from Maggie, who continued to regard him with the same calm attention, but from the diner's security cameras, which had been recording every moment of the interaction, and from Sarah Martinez, a young coffee shop employee who had been filming the confrontation from inside the diner with growing horror at what she was witnessing. As Jake reached toward Maggie's purse, suggesting that perhaps she could demonstrate her appreciation through a more direct contribution to their cause, several things happened simultaneously. Sarah's finger hit the record button on her phone's camera app, capturing the moment from inside the diner. Betty Collins looked up from the grill with the expression of someone whose patience had just run out entirely. And Maggie Chen, for the first time since leaving her car, allowed her carefully maintained facade of helpless elderly confusion to slip just enough to reveal what lay beneath. The change was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. Her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, her stance shifted to something more grounded, and her eyes took on a quality of assessment that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with tactical evaluation. For just a moment, the grandmother in the cardigan was replaced by someone else entirely, someone who had spent decades learning exactly how to handle situations like this one. Jake Morrison was too focused on his performance for the cameras to notice the shift, but Mike Brooks saw it clearly and felt his stomach drop as he realized they had made a serious miscalculation about their chosen target. Jake Morrison's hand hovered inches from Maggie's purse as the moment stretched into something electric and dangerous. The parking lot had grown quieter around them, other customers instinctively sensing the shift in atmosphere and either hurrying toward their vehicles or retreating deeper into the diner's safety. Even the ambient sounds of Highway 26 seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Blake Williams adjusted his phone's angle to capture what he was certain would be the climactic moment of their impromptu entertainment. His Instagram live feed had grown to nearly 200 viewers, drawn by his breathless commentary about the confrontation unfolding in real time. The comment stream scrolled rapidly across his screen, filled with laugh-crying emojis and increasingly crude suggestions for how to handle the elderly woman who had dared to interrupt their territorial display. The disconnect between what Blake's audience was seeing through his phone camera and what was actually happening in the parking lot would later become a case study in how perspective shapes reality. To the live-stream viewers, they were watching a harmless prank being played on a confused grandmother who had wandered into the wrong situation. The bikers appeared confident and in control, their leather jackets and chrome motorcycles lending them an aura of dangerous authenticity that translated well through the small screen. But Mike Brooks, standing close enough to see the subtle changes in Maggie's posture and expression, understood that they were witnessing something entirely different. The woman in the cream cardigan wasn't displaying the frozen panic or defensive anger that typically characterized victims of intimidation. Instead, she had entered a state of calm alertness that he recognized from his own military training, a condition of readiness that preceded action rather than submission. Tommy Rodriguez misread Maggie's stillness as capitulation and stepped closer, emboldened by what he perceived as her acceptance of their dominance. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced genuine consequences for his actions, suggesting that perhaps she could demonstrate her appreciation for their patience through a more substantial gesture than coffee purchases. The crude specificity of his demands made it clear that this had moved beyond casual harassment into something more predatory. Derek Anderson, desperate to cement his position within the group's hierarchy, added his own contribution to the escalating situation. His commentary about teaching proper respect to people who didn't understand their place was delivered with the false bravado of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. The nervous energy that had characterized his earlier behavior was transforming into something uglier, fed by the group dynamic and the perceived safety of their numbers. Inside the diner, Sarah Martinez had moved closer to the window, her phone's camera capturing the scene from an angle that Blake's live stream couldn't provide. What she saw through the glass made her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and fear. The elderly woman was completely surrounded now, the bikers having unconsciously arranged themselves in a semicircle that cut off her most direct routes to either her car or the diner entrance. Betty Collins emerged from behind the service counter, her expression grim as she assessed the situation developing in her parking lot. She had run Pinewood Diner for 15 years, serving everyone from long-haul truckers to weekend tourists, and she had developed an instinct for reading the difference between harmless posturing and genuine threat. What she was watching now had crossed that line, and her hand moved toward the phone beneath the register where she had programmed the sheriff's direct number. The escalation might have continued along its predictable trajectory, with the bikers growing bolder and more explicit in their demands while Maggie maintained her careful composure, except for an unexpected intervention from an unlikely source. Carmen Lopez, one of the diner's waitresses, pushed through the front door with the determined stride of someone who had reached the end of her patience. Carmen had been watching the confrontation unfold from inside the diner, her anger building with each passing moment. As a single mother, who had spent years dealing with men who thought they could intimidate women into compliance, she recognized the dynamics at play, and had decided that she wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen on her watch. Her appearance in the parking lot shifted the equation in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. Her voice cut through the afternoon air with the kind of authority that comes from years of managing difficult customers and unruly children. She informed the bikers that they were welcome to enjoy their coffee inside the diner like civilized human beings, but that harassment of other customers was not tolerated on the property. Her tone carried no trace of fear or uncertainty, simply the matter-of-fact delivery of someone stating established policy. Jake Morrison turned toward this new interruption with visible irritation, his carefully orchestrated performance being disrupted by someone who clearly didn't understand their place in the social hierarchy he was attempting to establish. His response to Carmen was delivered with the kind of condescending tone he might use with a disobedient child, suggesting that perhaps she should return to her serving duties and leave the adults to handle their business. The comment was a mistake of significant proportions. Carmen Lopez had survived an abusive marriage, worked 2 jobs while putting herself through community college, and raised 2 children largely on her own. She had learned long ago that backing down from bullies only encouraged them to escalate their behavior, and she had no intention of allowing these weekend warriors to think they could intimidate women with impunity. Her response was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that proved far more effective than shouting. She informed Jake that the only business being conducted in the parking lot was harassment, that such behavior was both illegal and unwelcome, and that he and his friends could either order food inside the diner or remove themselves from the property immediately. The choice, she made clear, was entirely theirs to make. Blake's live stream audience was eating up the developing confrontation, their comments urging him to capture the drama of multiple women trying to challenge their authority. The irony of their position, 5 leather-clad men on motorcycles being confronted by a grandmother and a waitress, was lost on viewers who saw only the surface dynamics of the situation. The comment stream filled with suggestions for handling what they termed difficult females and encouragement to assert their dominance more forcefully. Tommy Rodriguez stepped toward Carmen with the kind of swaggering movement that was designed to intimidate through size and proximity. His suggestion that she might want to reconsider her tone when speaking to her betters was accompanied by a gesture toward his jacket's Iron Wolves patch, as if the embroidered logo carried some kind of legal authority that superseded basic human decency. It was at this moment that Maggie Chen made her first active intervention in the confrontation that had been building around her. Her movement was subtle, a simple shift in position that placed her between Tommy and Carmen, but the effect was immediate and profound. For the first time since the confrontation began, she spoke with something other than polite deference, her voice carrying a note of quiet authority that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than social convention. Her words were simple and direct. She thanked Carmen for her concern, but assured her that the situation was under control. The tone in which she delivered this message carried implications that made everyone present reassess what they thought they understood about the dynamics at play. This was not the voice of a frightened elderly woman hoping for rescue, but something else entirely, the calm assertion of someone who had never needed rescuing and wasn't about to start now. Mike Brooks felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he processed what he was hearing. The shift in Maggie's voice triggered recognition patterns that he hadn't accessed in years, memories of drill instructors and special operations personnel who could command attention through tone alone. He opened his mouth to suggest that perhaps they should all step back and reassess the situation, but his words were lost in the noise of his teammates' escalating bravado. Jake Morrison, frustrated by the loss of control over what had been intended as a simple intimidation exercise, decided to reassert his dominance through more direct means. His movement toward Maggie was accompanied by language that made his intentions unmistakably clear. Crude suggestions about what kind of respect elderly women should show to younger men who were willing to tolerate their presence. The moment Jake's hand made contact with Maggie's shoulder, several things happened simultaneously across multiple timelines and platforms. Sarah Martinez's phone captured the exact instant of unwanted physical contact from her vantage point inside the diner. Blake's live stream recorded Jake's aggressive movement from the biker's perspective, though his commentary failed to acknowledge the legal implications of what his audience was witnessing. And security cameras throughout the parking lot documented every angle of what would later be analyzed frame by law enforcement professionals. But most significantly, Jake Morrison's decision to escalate from verbal harassment to physical contact triggered a response that none of them had anticipated or prepared for. Maggie Chen's careful facade of helpless elderly confusion disappeared entirely, replaced by something that made Mike Brooks take an involuntary step backward and caused Carmen Lopez to stop breathing altogether. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to recognize it. Maggie's posture shifted from the slightly stooped bearing of age to something much more grounded and balanced. Her hands, which had appeared soft and unused to physical exertion, revealed calluses and muscle memory that spoke of decades spent gripping weapons and climbing ropes. Most tellingly, her eyes took on a quality of assessment that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with tactical evaluation of targets and threats. Jake Morrison was still processing his surprise at the unexpected resistance he encountered when he tried to guide Maggie toward a more compliant position. Instead of the yielding softness he had expected from an elderly woman, his hand had met the kind of solid muscle tone that suggested someone who had maintained their physical conditioning well beyond retirement age. The disconnect between what he was seeing and what he was feeling created a moment of cognitive dissonance that left him temporarily confused. Tommy Rodriguez, emboldened by what he perceived as his leader's successful escalation to physical contact, moved to provide support by blocking Maggie's retreat route toward the diner entrance. His positioning was crude but effective, creating a tactical situation that would have been genuinely threatening to most elderly women. Unfortunately for Tommy, Maggie Chen was not most elderly women, and his movement placed him precisely where she needed him to be for what happened next. The technique Maggie employed was so smooth and economical that Blake's phone camera barely captured it, the movement appearing to his live stream audience as little more than a stumble or moment of clumsiness. Jake Morrison found himself suddenly off balance, his confident grip on Maggie's shoulder somehow redirected into a position that left him struggling to maintain his footing. The sensation was profoundly disorienting, as if the elderly woman had somehow used his own momentum against him in ways that defied his understanding of basic physics. Tommy Rodriguez's attempt to provide support for his leader resulted in an even more dramatic outcome. His movement toward Maggie was met with a response that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, a shift in positioning that left him sitting heavily on the pavement, with no clear understanding of how he had gotten there. The impact was hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs and leave him staring up at the sky with a confused expression that would later become a popular meme on social media platforms. Derek Anderson, witnessing the sudden reversal of his teammates' fortunes, reacted with the kind of panicked aggression that characterizes people who have never been in genuine physical confrontations. His movement toward Maggie was telegraphed and clumsy, driven more by adrenaline than strategy, and it provided her with an opportunity to demonstrate techniques that she had hoped never to use outside of training environments. The result was educational for everyone present. Derek found himself in a position that was simultaneously painful and completely immobilizing, held in place by leverage points that he didn't understand but couldn't escape. His attempts to struggle only increased his discomfort, and his demands for release were met with calm instructions about remaining still, until he could demonstrate that he had learned to control his aggressive impulses. Blake Williams, still attempting to maintain his live stream commentary while processing the rapid transformation of their entertainment into something much more serious, struggled to explain to his audience what they were witnessing. The cognitive dissonance between his established narrative about intimidating an elderly woman and the reality of his teammates being systematically neutralized by that same woman left him unable to maintain his usual confident banter. Mike Brooks, positioned where he could see the full scope of what was happening, finally found his voice and attempted to de-escalate the situation before it deteriorated further. His military experience had taught him to recognize when a tactical situation had shifted beyond recovery, and he understood that continuing to treat Maggie Chen as a helpless victim would only result in more painful lessons for his teammates. His suggestion that perhaps they should all step back and reassess the situation was delivered with the kind of urgency that comes from genuine concern for the safety of people who are making dangerous mistakes. He addressed Maggie directly, his tone respectful and slightly desperate, asking if she might be willing to release Derek and allow them all to extract themselves from what had clearly become an untenable position. Maggie's response was delivered with the same calm authority she had maintained throughout the confrontation, though now her words carried implications that made everyone present understand that the situation had fundamentally changed. She explained that she was perfectly willing to de-escalate, but that such de-escalation would require demonstrated understanding from all parties that harassment of other customers was neither acceptable nor safe. Jake Morrison, still struggling to process how his position of dominance had been so completely reversed, attempted to reassert his authority through angry demands for release and threats of legal consequences. His tone suggested someone who had never experienced genuine physical helplessness and was having difficulty accepting his current circumstances. The disconnect between his continued attempts at intimidation and his obvious inability to back up his threats with action created a surreal quality to his protests. Carmen Lopez, who had watched the entire sequence unfold with growing amazement, finally found her voice and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Her inquiry about Maggie's background was delivered with the kind of respectful curiosity that acknowledged they had all seriously underestimated the woman in the cream cardigan. Maggie's response was characteristically understated, a simple acknowledgement that she had spent some years in military service before retirement. The casual way she delivered this information, while maintaining perfect control over 3 grown men who had attempted to intimidate her, suggested depths of experience that none of them had anticipated encountering in a roadside diner parking lot. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance added a new dimension to the situation, indicating that someone had called law enforcement to respond to what had initially appeared to be a routine harassment incident. The timing was problematic for the Iron Wolves MC, whose social media documentation of their behavior would provide law enforcement with unusually complete evidence of their activities leading up to the current circumstances. Blake Williams finally stopped his live stream, the reality of their situation penetrating through his social media obsession, as he realized that his careful documentation of their harassment activities might not work in their favor when viewed by law enforcement professionals. His audience's comments had shifted from encouragement to confusion to outright criticism as viewers began to understand that they had been watching attempted intimidation of an elderly woman rather than harmless entertainment. The parking lot had grown crowded with witnesses as the confrontation drew other customers and passers-by who had been attracted by the commotion. Several people were openly filming the aftermath, their phones capturing the surreal image of a grandmother in a cardigan, maintaining calm control over 3 motorcycle gang members, while explaining basic principles of civil behavior to grown men who had apparently never learned them. Sarah Martinez emerged from the diner with Betty Collins, both women carrying expressions of grim satisfaction as they surveyed the resolution of the situation they had been watching develop with growing concern. The complete reversal of power dynamics had happened so quickly that they were still processing what they had witnessed, but the evidence was undeniable, in the form of 3 subdued bikers who were now receiving lessons in appropriate social behavior from their intended victim. Sheriff David Wilson pulled his patrol car into the Pinewood Diner parking lot, with the measured approach of someone who had spent 30 years responding to situations that were rarely what they initially appeared to be. The call had come in as a disturbance involving motorcycles and harassment of customers, routine enough that he hadn't felt the need for backup. What he observed as he stepped out of his vehicle suggested that perhaps his initial assessment had been overly optimistic. 3 men in leather jackets were positioned on the ground in various states of discomfort and confusion, while a woman who appeared to be in her late 60s stood nearby with a kind of relaxed alertness that Wilson recognized from his own military service decades earlier. The disconnect between the apparent ages and physical capabilities of the participants made him pause to reassess the tactical situation before approaching. The crowd of witnesses had grown to include most of the diner's customers and several passers-by who had been drawn by the commotion. Their phones were out, capturing every angle of what would later become one of the most widely shared examples of assumptions leading to consequences. The mood among the observers was a mixture of amazement and satisfaction, the kind of energy that accompanies justice being served in an unexpected but thoroughly appropriate manner. Mike Brooks approached Wilson with the careful movements of someone attempting to de-escalate a situation that had already spiraled well beyond his control. His explanation of events was delivered with the kind of measured honesty that comes from understanding that lies would only make their circumstances worse. He acknowledged that his team had initiated contact with the elderly woman, that the interaction had escalated beyond appropriate boundaries, and that the current situation was entirely the result of their own poor judgment. Wilson listened to Mike's account with the practiced attention of someone trained to extract useful information from chaotic situations. The bikers' obvious military bearing and willingness to accept responsibility for the incident suggested someone who understood the gravity of their circumstances and was attempting to minimize further damage. His teammates, still in various stages of processing their defeat at the hands of someone they had dismissed as harmless, were less coherent in their attempts at explanation. Jake Morrison's protests about the inappropriateness of their treatment carried the petulant tone of someone who had never faced genuine consequences for inappropriate behavior. His demands for medical attention and threats of legal action against what he termed an unprovoked assault demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both the law and the evidence that multiple cameras had captured regarding the actual sequence of events. Tommy Rodriguez remained largely silent, his attention focused on the painful education he had received regarding the difference between appearing tough and actually being capable of backing up aggressive behavior. The simple technique that had put him on the ground had been delivered with such casual efficiency that he was still trying to understand exactly what had happened to him. Derek Anderson's position was the most educational of the 3, held in place by leverage points that seemed to defy his understanding of basic anatomy, while simultaneously providing him with intimate knowledge of exactly how much pressure could be applied to joints without causing permanent damage. His attempts to negotiate his release were met with calm explanations of the conditions required for de-escalation. Betty Collins approached Wilson with the authority of someone who had been running her establishment long enough to earn the respect of local law enforcement. Her account of the incident was delivered with the kind of detailed observation that comes from years of managing situations involving difficult customers and alcohol-fueled confrontations. She had witnessed the entire sequence from the initial intimidation through the physical contact that had triggered Maggie's response. The security footage from the diner's cameras would later provide law enforcement with unusually complete documentation of the incident, but Betty's real-time testimony carried the weight of someone whose judgment Wilson had learned to trust over years of professional interaction. Her assessment that the bikers had initiated all contact and that the elderly woman had simply defended herself against unwanted physical aggression would prove to be entirely supported by video evidence. Carmen Lopez added her perspective as someone who had attempted to intervene before the situation escalated to physical confrontation. Her description of the bikers' behavior toward both Maggie and herself painted a clear picture of escalating harassment that had been deliberately designed to intimidate and humiliate. The crude nature of their comments and the increasingly aggressive tone of their demands left no ambiguity regarding their intentions. Sarah Martinez emerged from the diner with her phone in hand, offering Wilson access to the video she had captured from inside the establishment. The footage provided a clear angle on the moment when Jake Morrison had initiated physical contact, followed by the remarkably efficient neutralization of 3 attackers by someone who appeared to be a harmless grandmother. The disconnect between visual expectations and actual capabilities was stark enough to require multiple viewings for full comprehension. Wilson turned his attention to Maggie Chen, who had remained quietly observant throughout the various testimonies and explanations. Her demeanor suggested someone who was completely comfortable with law enforcement procedures and had no concerns about official scrutiny of her actions. When he asked for her account of events, her response was delivered with the kind of precise, factual reporting that he associated with military personnel providing after-action briefings. Maggie's explanation of the incident was notably free of emotional content or attempts at justification. She simply described the sequence of events from her arrival at the diner, through the escalation of verbal harassment to unwanted physical contact, and her measured response to eliminate the threat while minimizing injury to her attackers. Her tone suggested someone reporting facts rather than defending actions, as if the appropriateness of her response was self-evident. The casual way Maggie mentioned her military background in response to Wilson's questions about her training raised additional questions that would require more detailed investigation. Her acknowledgement that she had spent 25 years in Navy service, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss the weather, suggested depths of experience that were not immediately apparent from her grandmother exterior. Wilson's radio crackled with a request for status update from dispatch, and his response indicated that the situation was under control, but that he would need additional resources for processing multiple individuals involved in a harassment incident. The mention of assault charges being considered prompted immediate protests from Jake Morrison and Derek Anderson, whose understanding of legal definitions appeared to be limited to their own perspectives as initiators of the confrontation. The arrival of paramedics added another layer of complexity to the situation, as their assessment of the 3 bikers revealed the kind of precise application of force that suggested extensive training in non-lethal subdual techniques. The absence of serious injury, despite the obvious effectiveness of the techniques used, raised questions about Maggie's background that went well beyond casual military service. Frank Thompson, the Vietnam veteran who had been watching the situation develop from his pickup truck, finally approached Wilson with information that added context to what they had all witnessed. His recognition of Maggie's bearing and movement patterns suggested someone with specialized training that went beyond conventional military experience. His careful observation of her techniques during the brief confrontation had triggered memories of demonstrations he had witnessed decades earlier involving special operations personnel. The implications of Frank's assessment were significant enough that Wilson decided to request additional resources for what was clearly becoming a more complex investigation than routine harassment charges would typically require. His call to the county sheriff's office included a request for someone with military liaison experience to help evaluate the background and credentials of all parties involved. Meanwhile, Blake Williams sat in the back of Wilson's patrol car reviewing the footage he had captured on his phone, his live stream having documented their transformation from confident intimidators to subdued subjects of law enforcement investigation. The comment history from his social media followers provided a real-time record of public opinion, shifting from encouragement of harassment to criticism of their behavior as the true nature of their actions became apparent. The irony of their situation was not lost on Mike Brooks, who understood that their attempt to create viral content had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, though not in the way they had intended. The video evidence of their harassment activities, carefully documented by their own social media obsession, would provide prosecutors with unusually complete evidence of premeditation and escalating criminal behavior. Jake Morrison's continued protests about the appropriateness of their treatment demonstrated a fundamental failure to understand how completely their situation had deteriorated. His demands for equal treatment under the law carried a tone of entitlement that suggested someone who had never previously faced consequences for inappropriate behavior toward women or elderly individuals. Officer James Parker arrived as backup, bringing with him the kind of methodical approach to evidence collection that would ensure their case was properly documented for potential prosecution. His interview with witnesses and review of available video footage painted a clear picture of escalating harassment culminating in unwanted physical contact that had triggered a defensive response. The growing crowd of onlookers included several other veterans who had been drawn by the commotion and remained to witness the aftermath of what appeared to be a significant underestimation of an opponent. Their observations and comments to each other suggested recognition of techniques and capabilities that went well beyond civilian self-defense training. Carmen Lopez continued to provide support to Maggie, though it was becoming increasingly clear that such support was unnecessary. The elderly woman's calm handling of both the original confrontation and the subsequent law enforcement procedures suggested someone who was entirely comfortable with official scrutiny and had no concerns about the legal implications of her actions. Betty Collins coordinated with her staff to ensure that the diner remained operational despite the ongoing investigation in the parking lot. Her customers were clearly more interested in observing the aftermath of the confrontation than in continuing their meals, but she maintained her establishment's normal service standards while accommodating the unusual circumstances. The security footage review revealed the remarkable efficiency with which Maggie had neutralized 3 attackers without causing serious injury, a level of restraint that suggested extensive training in graduated response protocols. The techniques she had employed were clearly designed to control and subdue rather than inflict maximum damage, indicating professional-level training in conflict resolution. Wilson's preliminary assessment of the incident indicated clear criminal behavior on the part of the bikers, including harassment, intimidation, and assault charges that would be supported by extensive video evidence and witness testimony. The defensive actions taken by Maggie appeared to be entirely justified under Oregon's self-defense statutes, particularly given the disparity in numbers and the escalating nature of the threats she had faced. The arrival of additional law enforcement personnel allowed for more thorough processing of the scene and collection of evidence that would support prosecution of the harassment charges. The bikers' own social media documentation would prove to be their most damaging evidence, providing clear intent and premeditation for their targeting of elderly customers. Lisa Kim, the paramedic who had evaluated the 3 bikers, approached Wilson with her assessment of the injury sustained during the confrontation. Her professional opinion that the techniques used had been precisely calibrated to control without causing permanent damage suggested training that went well beyond civilian self-defense courses or basic military combat instruction. The growing realization among law enforcement personnel that they were dealing with someone whose background might require specialized investigation protocols prompted Wilson to contact his supervisors for guidance on how to proceed. The initial harassment complaint had evolved into something that might require federal involvement, depending on the nature of Maggie's military service record. Frank Thompson's continued observations about Maggie's bearing and the techniques she had employed provided additional context for Wilson's assessment of the situation. His recognition of specialized training patterns suggested that they might be dealing with someone whose military service had involved classified operations that would require careful handling by appropriate authorities. The irony of the bikers' social media strategy backfiring so completely was not lost on the gathered witnesses, many of whom had observed their initial swagger and confident harassment tactics transform into confusion and legal jeopardy. The transformation from entertainment content creators to subjects of criminal investigation had happened with remarkable speed. As Wilson continued his preliminary investigation, it became increasingly clear that the Iron Wolves MC had encountered someone whose background and capabilities were far beyond anything they had prepared for or could have anticipated. Their assumption that leather jackets and motorcycles would provide them with dominance over an elderly woman had proven to be catastrophically incorrect. The developing investigation would require careful coordination between local law enforcement and potentially federal agencies, depending on the classification level of Maggie's military service record. Wilson's experience told him that people who moved with her level of confidence around law enforcement typically had backgrounds that warranted additional scrutiny and professional courtesy. Captain Robert Hayes received the call while reviewing recruitment files at the Navy recruiting station in Portland, 43 miles from the unfolding situation at Pinewood Diner. The voice on the secure line belonged to Sheriff Wilson, whose request for assistance with verifying military credentials had taken an unexpected turn when the name Margaret Chen triggered automatic security protocols in the Navy's personnel database. The conversation that followed would later be classified at levels that Sheriff Wilson didn't possess clearance to access, but Hayes' immediate response conveyed the gravity of what law enforcement had stumbled upon. His instructions were delivered with the kind of urgent precision that suggested they had moved well beyond routine military record verification into territory that required immediate federal coordination. Hayes disconnected the call and immediately accessed communication channels that hadn't been used in over a decade, reaching out to contacts who had long since moved into positions where their previous operational knowledge served different purposes. The responses he received confirmed what the database flags had already indicated. Margaret Chen was not simply a retired Navy service member, but someone whose very existence in civilian life represented one of the military's most carefully guarded secrets. At the diner, Wilson continued processing the scene while waiting for guidance from federal authorities who were apparently racing to respond to what had initially appeared to be a routine harassment complaint. The transformation of his simple assault investigation into something requiring security clearances and federal coordination left him with the uncomfortable realization that his small-town law enforcement experience had not prepared him for the complexities now unfolding. Commander Patricia Brooks was conducting a training exercise at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado when her encrypted communication device activated with the kind of priority alert that indicated operational security had been compromised. The brief she received from Captain Hayes painted a picture that made her stop the exercise immediately and begin coordinating resources for damage control measures that might not be sufficient to contain what had already been exposed. The name Margaret Chen carried weight in circles where operational histories were measured in classified missions rather than public service records. Brooks had heard whispers about the woman who had somehow convinced Navy leadership to allow her to serve in capacities that officially didn't exist for female personnel, whose operational record remained buried in files that required presidential clearance to access. The irony that such a carefully protected secret had been exposed by a group of amateur bikers with social media accounts was not lost on Brooks, as she coordinated with federal agencies whose existence was barely acknowledged outside security circles. The situation required delicate handling to prevent operational secrets from becoming public knowledge, while ensuring that justice was served for the harassment incident. Blake Williams sat in the back of a patrol car, reviewing the footage he had captured, slowly beginning to understand that his live stream audience had witnessed something far more significant than the casual harassment of an elderly woman. The comments on his social media posts had shifted from crude encouragement to increasingly sophisticated analysis by viewers who recognized techniques and capabilities that suggested military training far beyond conventional service. The viral nature of his inadvertent documentation meant that speculation about Maggie's background was already spreading across platforms where military enthusiasts and veterans gathered to discuss operational history and classified programs. The attention his video was receiving from users with obvious military backgrounds suggested that they had accidentally exposed something that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. Frank Thompson approached Maggie with the respectful caution of someone who had learned to recognize operational personnel even decades after their service had ended. His quiet conversation with her revealed connections to programs and operations that explained both her capabilities and the federal response that was clearly building around their small-town incident. Thompson's own service in Vietnam had included exposure to personnel who operated in capacities that weren't acknowledged in official records. Individuals whose training and missions existed in the gray areas where conventional military structure gave way to operational necessity. His recognition of Maggie's techniques had triggered memories of demonstrations that had been classified above his clearance level even then. The conversation between the two veterans was conducted in the kind of careful language that acknowledged shared understanding while avoiding specific details that might violate security protocols still binding decades after the relevant operations had concluded. Thompson's quiet confirmation that he understood the sensitivity of the situation provided Maggie with assurance that at least one witness grasped the potential implications of what had been exposed. Sheriff Wilson received updated instructions from federal coordinators who were converging on the situation with resources that seemed disproportionate to a simple harassment case. The arrival of personnel with credentials that required verification through channels he didn't normally access confirmed that Margaret Chen's background involved classified operations that remained sensitive decades after her official retirement. The federal response team included specialists in operational security and public information management, individuals whose job was to ensure that classified capabilities didn't become public knowledge through accidents or unauthorized disclosure. Their assessment of the social media exposure and witness accounts would determine what measures were necessary to protect information that remained vital to national security. Mike Brooks found himself being interviewed by federal agents whose questions focused less on the harassment incident and more on his observations of Maggie's techniques and capabilities. His military background provided him with sufficient context to understand that they had encountered someone whose training represented investments in human capabilities that the military preferred to keep secret. The agent's interest in exactly what techniques had been employed and how effectively they had been applied suggested that Maggie's operational skills remained relevant to current military planning and training protocols. The efficiency with which she had neutralized 3 attackers without causing serious injury represented tactical capabilities that were apparently still classified above the level that local law enforcement was cleared to understand. Jake Morrison's demands for equal treatment under the law took on a different character as federal agents explained that his social media documentation of the incident had potentially exposed classified military capabilities to public view. The harassment charges he was facing had become secondary to national security concerns that required careful management to prevent further unauthorized disclosure. The legal implications of his livestream extended well beyond simple assault charges into territory involving unauthorized documentation of classified personnel and capabilities. The federal agents made it clear that his cooperation in limiting further exposure of sensitive information would be a significant factor in determining how aggressively they pursued charges related to operational security violations. Tommy Rodriguez and Derek Anderson found themselves facing similar interviews, though their roles as followers rather than leaders in the harassment incident afforded them slightly more favorable consideration from federal investigators. Their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and cooperate with efforts to contain the security implications of their actions would determine whether they faced federal charges in addition to local assault and harassment violations. The transformation of their weekend entertainment into a potential national security incident provided all 3 bikers with a harsh education in the consequences of targeting individuals whose backgrounds they had made no effort to understand. Their assumption that elderly women represented safe targets for harassment had proven catastrophically incorrect in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. Carmen Lopez found herself being briefed by federal personnel on the sensitivity of what she had witnessed and the importance of limiting discussion of specific techniques or capabilities that had been demonstrated. Her role as a witness to the incident was important for local prosecution, but her observations about Maggie's tactical skills needed to remain confidential to protect operational security. The federal briefing she received included explanations of why certain military capabilities remained classified even decades after development, and how public awareness of specific techniques could compromise current operations and personnel safety. Her agreement to limit her public discussion of technical details was presented as both a legal requirement and a patriotic duty. Betty Collins coordinated with federal agents to ensure that her diner security footage was properly secured and that copies were limited to official investigation channels. The complete documentation of the incident from multiple camera angles provided federal investigators with detailed analysis opportunities while requiring careful control to prevent unauthorized distribution. The federal presence at her establishment attracted attention from local media outlets, whose inquiries about the nature of the investigation required careful management to prevent speculation about classified military programs from entering public discourse. The cover story of a routine harassment investigation provided plausible explanation for law enforcement presence while avoiding details that might trigger deeper media investigation. Captain Hayes arrived at the scene with credentials that immediately shifted the dynamic of the investigation from local law enforcement to federal coordination. His conversation with Maggie was conducted with the kind of professional courtesy that acknowledged both her service record and the sensitivity of maintaining operational security around her background. Hayes' assessment of the situation focused on damage control measures necessary to prevent classified information from becoming public knowledge, while ensuring that justice was appropriately served for the harassment incident. The challenge lay in prosecuting the biker's criminal behavior without exposing details about Maggie's capabilities that remained classified for national security reasons. The coordination between military and civilian law enforcement required careful balancing of legal requirements with security protocols that had been developed to protect operational personnel and capabilities. Hayes' experience with such coordination proved essential in developing an approach that satisfied both justice and security requirements. Commander Brooks arrived with a security team whose presence transformed the parking lot into a controlled environment where classified discussions could occur without compromising operational security. Her reunion with Maggie carried the weight of shared service in programs that few people were cleared to acknowledge, let alone discuss in detail. The conversation between Brooks and Maggie was conducted in the careful language of operational veterans, who understood that their service remained sensitive decades after completion. Brooks' assessment of the exposure incident would determine what measures were necessary to protect current operations and personnel from compromises resulting from the inadvertent disclosure. Brooks's briefing of federal investigators emphasized the importance of ensuring that prosecution of the harassment charges didn't require public disclosure of classified capabilities or operational history. The challenge of achieving justice while protecting national security required coordination between agencies whose normal procedures weren't designed for such circumstances. The resolution of criminal charges against the Iron Wolves MC members was expedited through plea agreements that acknowledged their guilt while avoiding trial proceedings that might require public disclosure of classified information. Their cooperation with federal efforts to limit further exposure of sensitive details became a significant factor in determining their sentences. Jake Morrison's role as the primary instigator of the harassment resulted in federal charges related to operational security violations in addition to local assault and harassment convictions. His social media documentation of the incident provided federal prosecutors with clear evidence of intent to exploit and embarrass what he had assumed was a vulnerable target. Tommy Rodriguez and Derek Anderson received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation with security investigators and their agreements to participate in community service programs that would educate them about appropriate behavior toward elderly individuals and veterans. Their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and accept responsibility contributed to plea agreements that avoided lengthy federal trials. Blake Williams faced additional charges related to unauthorized documentation and distribution of classified capabilities through his social media platforms. His livestream had inadvertently created a permanent record of tactical techniques that remained classified for operational security reasons, requiring careful coordination with platform administrators to limit further distribution. Mike Brooks received the most favorable treatment due to his military background and his attempts to de-escalate the situation before it reached physical confrontation. His cooperation with federal investigators and his understanding of the security implications involved resulted in reduced charges and opportunities for alternative sentencing that acknowledged his veteran status. The community response to the incident evolved as residents learned more about Maggie's background and the significance of her service. The initial entertainment value of watching bikers receive unexpected consequences transformed into respect for someone whose contributions to national security had previously gone unrecognized in their small town. Frank Thompson organized a quiet recognition ceremony that acknowledged Maggie's service while respecting the classified nature of her operational history. The gathering of local veterans provided an opportunity for the community to express appreciation for her contributions without requiring disclosure of sensitive details about her military career. Carmen Lopez found herself appointed as an informal liaison between Maggie and the diner staff, ensuring that her weekly visits continued to be welcomed and that she received the respect her service had earned. The relationship that developed between them provided both women with connections that enriched their lives while honoring the circumstances that had brought them together. Betty Collins instituted a policy at her diner that explicitly prohibited harassment of any customers, with special emphasis on respecting elderly patrons and veterans whose service might not be immediately apparent. The incident became a teaching moment for her staff about the importance of treating all customers with dignity, regardless of their appearance or apparent vulnerability. Sarah Martinez used her footage of the incident to create educational content about recognizing and preventing harassment, though she carefully edited out technical details about combat techniques that federal investigators had classified. Her social media presence evolved to focus on supporting elderly individuals and veterans who faced discrimination or harassment. Sheriff Wilson incorporated the lessons learned from the incident into training programs for his department, emphasizing the importance of recognizing when routine investigations might involve classified military personnel or operations. The federal coordination required for the case provided valuable experience in managing situations that crossed jurisdictional and security boundaries. The Iron Wolves MC disbanded following the legal resolution of the incident, its members, having learned that their weekend warrior approach to motorcycle culture carried serious risks when applied inappropriately. The viral documentation of their defeat by an elderly woman became a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance. Maggie Chen continued her weekly drives to Portland to visit her grandchildren, though her stops at Pinewood Diner now carried a different character. The respect she received from staff and customers reflected community understanding of her service, even if the specific details remained classified for security reasons. The federal investigation concluded that while operational security had been compromised through the inadvertent exposure, the incident had been contained sufficiently to prevent serious damage to current military capabilities. The lessons learned about protecting classified personnel in civilian environments informed updated security protocols for retired special operations personnel. The story of the confrontation at Pinewood Diner became part of local folklore, told and retold with the kind of satisfaction that comes from witnessing justice served in unexpected ways. The transformation of apparent victims into revealed heroes provided the community with a narrative that reinforced values about respect, service, and the dangers of judging people based on surface appearances. The incident served as a reminder that heroism and capability often exist in forms that don't announce themselves, that strength can be found in unexpected places, and that the price of disrespecting those who have served their country can be far higher than weekend warriors might anticipate. In a world where social media encouraged people to seek entertainment at others' expense, Maggie Chen's quiet demonstration of capability provided a powerful lesson about the consequences of mistaking restraint for weakness. The parking lot of Pinewood Diner returned to its normal function as a stopping point for travelers along Highway 26, but the memory of what had transpired there continued to influence how visitors and locals alike approached their interactions with fellow citizens. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, delivered with a precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding. The classified briefing room at Naval Base Kitsap fell silent as Admiral Jennifer Walsh reviewed the after-action report from the Pinewood Diner incident. 3 months had passed since a routine harassment complaint had inadvertently exposed one of the Navy's most closely guarded secrets, and the ramifications were still being assessed by intelligence analysts, whose clearance levels exceeded those of most cabinet members. The irony was not lost on Walsh that Margaret Chen, whose operational existence had been successfully concealed for over 2 decades of active service and 15 years of retirement, had been compromised by 5 amateur bikers with smartphones and delusions of grandeur. The careful construction of her cover identity as a simple Navy nurse had survived foreign intelligence services and investigative journalists, only to be undone by weekend warriors seeking viral content. The viral nature of Blake Williams' livestream had created cascading effects that continued to complicate federal efforts to contain the security breach. Despite swift action to remove the original footage from major platforms, copies had proliferated across military enthusiast forums and veteran social media groups, where users with operational experience had immediately recognized the significance of what they were viewing. Analysis teams working around the clock had identified over 200 instances where the footage had been reposted, shared, or discussed in contexts that revealed increasing awareness of Margaret's true background. Each new iteration of the story added details and speculation that brought the public closer to understanding capabilities that remained vital to current special operations protocols. The challenge facing Walsh and her security team was unprecedented in its scope and complexity. Traditional operational security measures were designed to prevent disclosure of classified information, not to contain exposure that had already occurred in such a public and documented manner. The usual protocols of denial and misdirection were insufficient when confronted with video evidence that clearly demonstrated capabilities beyond civilian self-defense training. Dr. Marcus Hernandez, the Navy's chief psychologist for special operations personnel, had spent weeks analyzing the psychological impact of exposure on Margaret herself. His assessment painted a picture of someone who had successfully compartmentalized decades of classified service while maintaining the cover identity necessary for civilian reintegration, only to have that careful balance disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. The transition from classified operator to suburban grandmother had required extensive psychological support and identity reconstruction that few people outside the special operations community could comprehend. Margaret's ability to maintain her cover while raising a family and participating in community life represented a level of operational discipline that exceeded the requirements of active service. The exposure incident had forced Margaret to confront aspects of her identity that she had successfully suppressed for over a decade. The muscle memory and tactical reflexes that had emerged during the confrontation represented capabilities that she had deliberately allowed to atrophy through years of peaceful civilian life. Commander Patricia Brooks returned from her third visit to Pinewood Diner with recommendations that would reshape how the Navy protected retired special operations personnel living in civilian communities. Her interviews with local residents revealed a sophisticated network of veteran support that had naturally developed around Margaret without any awareness of her classified background. The community's instinctive protection of their neighbor suggested that operational personnel possessed qualities that attracted respect and loyalty, even when their training remained hidden. Brooks' analysis indicated that Margaret's integration into civilian life had been more successful than traditional metrics suggested, creating social connections that provided security through obscurity rather than isolation. Frank Thompson had become an unofficial spokesman for the veteran community's perspective on the incident, his careful statements to media outlets walking the line between acknowledging Margaret's service and avoiding disclosure of classified details. His own military experience provided him with sufficient understanding of operational security requirements to craft public responses that satisfied community curiosity without compromising national security. The relationship that had developed between Frank and Margaret represented a model for how classified personnel could maintain social connections while preserving operational security. Their shared understanding of military service created a foundation for friendship that didn't require disclosure of specific operational details or capabilities. The broader veteran community's response to the incident had surprised federal analysts who had expected more aggressive attempts to uncover classified information. Instead, veterans with operational experience had largely rallied to protect Margaret's privacy while expressing satisfaction that her harassers had received appropriate consequences for their behavior. Carmen Lopez had experienced her own transformation in the months following the incident, her role as a witness to extraordinary events having awakened interests in veteran support and community service that she had never previously considered. Her part-time enrollment in a social work program focused on serving military families represented one of many ripple effects that continued to emanate from the confrontation. The mentoring relationship that had developed between Carmen and Margaret provided both women with connections that enriched their lives while serving as a model for civilian veteran integration. Carmen's willingness to learn about military culture and Margaret's openness to sharing appropriate aspects of her experience created a bridge between communities that often remained separate. Betty Collins had transformed Pinewood Diner into an unofficial gathering place for veterans throughout the region, her establishment becoming known for its welcoming atmosphere and explicit policies protecting service members from harassment or discrimination. The incident had awakened her awareness of the veteran community's needs and her establishment's potential role in serving those needs. The monthly breakfast gathering that Betty hosted for local veterans had grown from a handful of regulars to over 50 participants, creating a forum for peer support and community building that extended well beyond her diner's walls. The success of these gatherings had inspired similar initiatives throughout Oregon and neighboring states. Sarah Martinez had leveraged her footage of the incident into a career change that focused on documenting veteran stories and advocacy work that supported military families facing transition challenges. Her careful editing of the original video to remove classified details while preserving the incident's educational value had earned recognition from federal agencies responsible for operational security. The nonprofit organization that Sarah had founded used storytelling and multimedia content to bridge the gap between civilian communities and military families, helping to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that had led to the Pinewood Diner confrontation. Her work represented a constructive response to the incident that served broader community interests. The legal resolution of the Iron Wolves MC case had created precedents for how harassment of military personnel would be prosecuted under expanded federal hate crime statutes. The enhanced penalties that Jake Morrison and his associates had received sent clear messages about the consequences of targeting service members or veterans for entertainment or intimidation. Jake Morrison's 18-month federal sentence had included mandatory participation in veteran services programs that educated him about military culture and the sacrifices made by service members and their families. His transformation from antagonist to advocate represented one of the incident's more unexpected outcomes, though federal monitors continued to track his compliance with security agreements. Blake Williams' social media presence had been permanently altered by the incident, his accounts now carrying federal monitoring requirements that limited his ability to post content involving military personnel or veterans. His mandatory community service with veteran support organizations had provided him with education about the consequences of exploitation and harassment. The disbanding of the Iron Wolves MC had scattered its former members across different paths of accountability and growth. Tommy Rodriguez had enrolled in vocational training programs while performing community service at veteran support facilities, his experience with genuine consequences having motivated significant personal change. Derek Anderson's participation in restorative justice programs had brought him into contact with combat veterans, whose stories helped him understand the gravity of his actions and the harm caused by harassment of service members. His required financial contributions to veteran charities represented ongoing accountability for his role in the incident. Mike Brooks had emerged from the legal proceedings with enhanced appreciation for his own military service and renewed connections to the veteran community. His role as a character witness for his former associates had evolved into ongoing advocacy work that helped other veterans avoid the pitfalls of extremist groups and antisocial behavior. The federal investigation's final report had identified systemic weaknesses in how retired special operations personnel were protected and supported during their transitions to civilian life. The recommendations emerging from this analysis would influence policy changes affecting thousands of classified personnel nationwide. Enhanced background screening for businesses serving military communities had been implemented to identify potential security risks before they could exploit vulnerable personnel. These measures were designed to prevent the kind of targeting that had occurred at Pinewood Diner, while preserving the open access that made civilian integration possible. Training programs for local law enforcement had been expanded to include modules on recognizing and properly handling incidents involving classified military personnel. Sheriff Wilson's experience with federal coordination had been incorporated into curricula that prepared other agencies for similar situations. The psychological support services available to retired special operations personnel had been significantly enhanced based on analysis of Margaret's successful civilian integration and the factors that had contributed to her ability to maintain operational security while building genuine community connections. Margaret Chen's weekly drives to Portland had resumed their normal rhythm, though her stops at Pinewood Diner now carried additional meaning as symbols of successful community integration and mutual respect. The relationships she had built within the local community represented achievements that exceeded her operational accomplishments in their contribution to her personal fulfillment. The grandchildren whose weekly visits had motivated her regular travels remained unaware of the full scope of their grandmother's service, though their pride in her military background had grown as age-appropriate details were shared with their parents' careful guidance. The family's understanding of operational security requirements had strengthened their bonds while protecting sensitive information. The classified memorial service held at Naval Base Kitsap had provided Margaret with formal recognition from the special operations community for her groundbreaking service as one of the first women to serve in capacities that officially didn't exist. The ceremony represented closure for a career whose contributions had been necessarily invisible during her active service. The awards and commendations presented during the memorial service included recognition for operational achievements that had saved countless lives and advanced American interests in theaters where conventional forces couldn't operate. The declassification of selected portions of her service record allowed for acknowledgement that had been impossible during her active career. Admiral Walsh's personal presentation of a classified decoration that recognized Margaret's unique contributions to special operations doctrine represented the Navy's highest acknowledgement of service that had redefined possibilities for female personnel in combat roles. The award's classification level ensured that its significance would remain known only to those with appropriate clearance. The strategic impact assessment completed by the Defense Intelligence Agency had concluded that while operational security had been compromised through the Pinewood Diner incident, the exposure had been contained sufficiently to prevent serious damage to current capabilities or personnel safety. The lessons learned from managing the crisis had actually enhanced protective protocols for classified personnel. The positive community response to Margaret's revealed background had surprised intelligence analysts who had expected more aggressive attempts to exploit the security breach. Instead, the incident had strengthened civilian-military relationships in ways that enhanced, rather than compromised, operational security for retired special operations personnel. The congressional briefing on the incident had resulted in increased funding for veteran transition programs and enhanced legal protections for military personnel facing harassment or discrimination. The bipartisan support for these measures reflected widespread recognition that service members deserve protection from exploitation. Educational initiatives launched in response to the incident had reached millions of Americans through school programs, community presentations, and media campaigns that promoted understanding of military service and veteran issues. These efforts represented constructive responses that transformed a security crisis into opportunities for improved civilian-military relations. The international intelligence community's reaction to the incident had been carefully monitored by American security agencies, with assessments indicating that foreign services had gained limited actionable intelligence from the exposure. The aging of the revealed capabilities and their evolution beyond Margaret's active service period had minimized strategic damage. The academic studies emerging from analysis of the incident had contributed to scholarly understanding of veteran integration challenges and community support systems that facilitated successful transitions to civilian life. These research efforts were providing evidence-based recommendations for policy improvements affecting all veterans. The cultural impact of Margaret's story had extended well beyond veteran communities, inspiring broader conversations about respecting elderly individuals and recognizing that capabilities and achievements often exist in forms that don't announce themselves. The incident had become a touchstone for discussions about judging people based on appearances rather than character. The annual commemoration held at Pinewood Diner brought together community members, veterans, and federal officials to reflect on the lessons learned from the incident and to recognize the ongoing importance of mutual respect and understanding between civilian and military communities. These gatherings had become models for similar events nationwide. Margaret's continued residence in Welch's represented a successful resolution to the crisis that had threatened to upend her carefully constructed civilian life. The enhanced security measures that protected her while preserving her community connections demonstrated that classified personnel could maintain meaningful civilian relationships without compromising national security. The legacy of the Pinewood Diner incident extended far beyond the immediate participants, influencing policy changes, community relationships, and cultural understanding that would benefit veterans and civilian communities for generations to come. The transformation of a simple harassment complaint into a catalyst for positive change represented the kind of unintended consequences that sometimes emerge from crisis situations. The quiet dignity with which Margaret had handled both the original confrontation and its aftermath had provided a model for how extraordinary individuals could navigate exposure while maintaining their values and protecting their communities. Her example would influence how future generations of special operations personnel approach the challenges of civilian integration. The story of 5 bikers who learned the hard way not to judge a quiet grandmother had become more than entertainment or cautionary tale. It had evolved into a reminder that heroism often wears ordinary clothes, that strength doesn't always announce itself, and that the price of disrespecting those who have served their country extends far beyond individual consequences to touch entire communities and institutions. In a world where social media encouraged snap judgments and superficial assessments, Margaret Chen's demonstration that appearances could be profoundly deceiving had provided millions of people with pause for reflection about their own assumptions and behaviors. The ripple effects of her moment of revealed capability would continue to influence how Americans thought about service, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes who walked among them every day. The transformation of Pinewood Diner from a simple roadside establishment into a symbol of community respect and veteran appreciation represented the kind of positive change that could emerge from even the most challenging circumstances. The lessons learned in that parking lot on a Saturday afternoon had traveled far beyond Oregon to influence hearts and minds across a nation grateful for those who had served in silence and anonymity. 5 years after the incident that transformed a quiet Saturday afternoon into a watershed moment for veteran recognition and community respect, Pinewood Diner had evolved into something far beyond its original purpose as a roadside stopping point for travelers along Highway 26. The modest establishment now served as an unofficial pilgrimage site for veterans, military families, and civilians seeking to understand the deeper meanings of service and sacrifice that had been so dramatically revealed in its parking lot. Margaret Chen sat in her customary corner booth, the same red vinyl seat she had occupied every Saturday for nearly 8 years now, watching as her granddaughter Emily practiced reading from a children's book about military heroes. At 12 years old, Emily possessed the kind of confident curiosity that reminded Margaret of herself at that age, asking probing questions about history and justice that required careful answers from adults who understood the complexities of both. The book Emily was reading had been written by Sarah Martinez, whose career transformation from coffee shop employee to acclaimed author and veteran advocate had been one of the many unexpected outcomes of that transformative day. The children's book series that Sarah had created carefully navigated the challenge of honoring military service while avoiding the graphic realities of combat, providing young readers with age-appropriate insights into concepts of duty, sacrifice, and quiet heroism. Emily's questions about the story inevitably led to discussions about her grandmother's own service, conversations that had evolved over the years as the child matured and could handle increasingly complex truths about the realities of military life. Margaret had learned to balance her granddaughter's natural curiosity with the operational security requirements that still governed much of her past, finding ways to convey important lessons without revealing classified details. The relationship between grandmother and granddaughter had deepened significantly since the public revelation of Margaret's military background, though Emily's parents had been careful to maintain age-appropriate boundaries around the more sensitive aspects of her service record. The pride that Emily felt in her grandmother's accomplishments was evident in her school presentations and writing assignments that consistently focused on themes of service and courage. Carmen Lopez emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee and a slice of apple pie that had become Margaret's traditional Saturday treat, their weekly interaction having evolved into a friendship that transcended the circumstances of their initial meeting. Carmen's completion of her social work degree had opened new career opportunities, but she had chosen to remain at Pinewood Diner while building a private practice that specialized in veteran family counseling. The mentoring relationship between Carmen and Margaret had proven beneficial to both women, providing Carmen with insights into military culture that enhanced her effectiveness as a counselor, while giving Margaret opportunities to contribute to veteran support efforts without compromising her security requirements. Their collaboration had resulted in support programs that were being replicated in communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Betty Collins approached their table with the kind of proprietary satisfaction that comes from watching positive change take root in one's own establishment, her transformation from diner owner to community leader having been one of the more surprising developments of the intervening years. The monthly veteran breakfast gatherings that she hosted had grown into a regional phenomenon, attracting participants from across Oregon and Washington who traveled significant distances to participate in the supportive community that had developed around her establishment. The success of Betty's veteran outreach efforts had attracted attention from national organizations focused on military family support, resulting in funding opportunities and recognition awards that had elevated both her profile and that of her small-town diner. The irony that a harassment incident had ultimately generated millions of dollars in positive economic impact for her community was not lost on Betty, who had become a sought-after speaker at conferences focused on veteran integration and community support. Frank Thompson entered the diner with his usual Saturday morning routine, his role as unofficial spokesperson for the local veteran community having evolved into more formal positions with regional advocacy organizations. His careful navigation of public interest in the Margaret Chen story had demonstrated skills in media relations and community organizing that had surprised even him, leading to opportunities for influence that extended well beyond his initial involvement as a witness to extraordinary events. The friendship that had developed between Frank and Margaret represented a model for peer support among veterans that had been studied and replicated by researchers interested in successful civilian integration strategies. Their shared understanding of military culture and operational security requirements had created a foundation for mutual support that didn't require disclosure of sensitive details while providing both individuals with connections to their service backgrounds. The documentary film crew that had been granted carefully limited access to the Pinewood Diner story was conducting final interviews for a project that would premiere at the Sundance Film Festival, their work representing the first major media production to receive federal approval for depicting aspects of classified military operations. The filmmakers' sensitive approach to operational security concerns had resulted in a narrative that honored Margaret's service while protecting information that remained vital to national security. The documentary's focus on community response and veteran integration rather than specific operational details had satisfied federal reviewers, while creating compelling content that would reach mainstream audiences with important messages about respect for military service and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances. The film's planned educational distribution would ensure that Margaret's story reached classrooms and community centers nationwide. Josh Miller, now a senior at Oregon State University studying journalism, stopped by Margaret's table during his shift break to discuss his senior thesis project on the long-term social impacts of viral incidents involving military personnel. His perspective as someone who had witnessed the original incident while working at the diner provided unique insights into how sudden exposure could transform both individuals and communities in ways that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Josh's academic research had revealed patterns in how communities responded to the discovery of hidden military heroes among their residents, identifying factors that contributed to positive outcomes versus those that resulted in exploitation or harassment of exposed personnel. His findings were contributing to policy recommendations for protecting retired special operations personnel, while enabling their successful integration into civilian communities. The academic symposium that Josh was organizing for the following month would bring together researchers, policymakers, and community leaders to discuss lessons learned from the Pinewood Diner incident and similar cases nationwide. The event represented recognition that Margaret's story had implications extending well beyond individual justice to encompass broader questions about civilian-military relations and community support systems. Maria Santos, the local teacher who had become one of the diner's regular Saturday morning customers, approached Margaret with a request that had become routine over the years. Her students' questions about local history inevitably led to age-appropriate discussions about the incident and its aftermath, creating opportunities for lessons about respect, service, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating others. The curriculum that Maria had developed around the themes emerging from Margaret's story had been adopted by school districts throughout Oregon, providing educators with frameworks for discussing military service and veteran issues in ways that promoted understanding and respect among young people. The success of these educational initiatives had contributed to measurable improvements in civilian-military relations within communities that implemented the programs. The scholarship fund that had been established in Margaret's name provided financial assistance to children of military families pursuing higher education, with selection criteria that emphasized community service and leadership rather than academic achievement alone. The fund's success had exceeded all expectations, generating enough resources to support dozens of students annually while creating networks of young people committed to serving others. Sheriff David Wilson entered the diner for his weekly coffee and informal community briefing, his department's experience with the federal coordination required by the Margaret Chen case having positioned him as a regional expert in managing incidents involving classified military personnel. The training programs that he had developed for law enforcement agencies had been adopted throughout the Pacific Northwest, improving preparedness for similar situations while building stronger relationships between police departments and veteran communities. Wilson's transformation from small-town sheriff to recognized authority on civilian-military law enforcement cooperation had opened opportunities for consulting work with federal agencies and speaking engagements at national conferences. His emphasis on treating all community members with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent status or background, had become a model for progressive policing approaches that emphasized service over enforcement. The memorial garden that had been established adjacent to the diner honored local veterans whose service had previously gone unrecognized, with Margaret's story serving as inspiration for community efforts to identify and acknowledge military heroes who had returned to civilian life without fanfare. The garden's dedication ceremony had attracted visitors from across the country, including high-ranking military officials who spoke about the importance of community support for veteran integration. The garden's design incorporated elements that honored all branches of military service, while maintaining the operational security requirements necessary to protect personnel whose service remained classified. The careful balance between recognition and protection had been achieved through consultation with federal agencies and veteran organizations that understood both the importance of acknowledgement and the risks of exposure. Blake Williams arrived at the diner in his capacity as a volunteer coordinator for veteran support activities, his transformation from social media provocateur to community advocate, representing one of the most dramatic personal changes resulting from the incident. His mandatory community service had evolved into genuine commitment to veteran causes, with his technological skills being redirected toward positive purposes that served military families and community organizations. The nonprofit organization that Blake had founded focused on using social media and digital platforms to support veteran integration and prevent the kind of harassment that had characterized his own behavior years earlier. His personal experience with the consequences of exploiting military personnel had given him unique credibility in educating others about appropriate behavior and the importance of respecting service members and their families. The restorative justice program that had been central to Blake's rehabilitation had become a model for addressing harassment and discrimination cases involving military personnel, with its emphasis on education and community service proving more effective than traditional punitive approaches in creating lasting behavioral change. Blake's ongoing participation as both coordinator and speaker had helped hundreds of individuals understand the harm caused by their actions while providing pathways for positive contribution to their communities. Tommy Rodriguez entered the diner wearing the uniform of the Veterans Administration Medical Center, where he had found employment after completing his vocational training. his work as a patient transport aide having given him daily exposure to the realities of military service and sacrifice that he had previously failed to understand. His direct interaction with wounded veterans had provided education about the costs of military service that no academic program could have delivered. Tommy's transformation from weekend warrior to healthcare worker, serving disabled veterans, represented redemption through service that had surprised even the federal agents who had overseen his rehabilitation. His willingness to share his story with other young men who exhibited similar patterns of aggressive behavior had made him an effective advocate for early intervention programs that prevented harassment before it occurred. The peer counseling certification that Tommy had earned through his work with veteran patients had opened opportunities for him to serve as a bridge between civilian communities and military families, helping to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that had led to his own confrontation with Margaret. His personal experience with the consequences of disrespecting veterans had given him unique credibility in educational settings where his message might otherwise be dismissed. Derek Anderson arrived for his weekly volunteer shift at the diner's Veteran Support Office, his role in organizing transportation services for elderly veterans representing his ongoing commitment to making amends for his past behavior. The consistent nature of his service over multiple years had demonstrated genuine change rather than mere compliance with legal requirements, earning him acceptance within the veteran community that he had once antagonized. Derek's development of ride-sharing networks that connected younger veterans with elderly service members had addressed practical needs while creating intergenerational relationships that benefited both groups. His understanding of social media and digital communication had proven valuable in organizing these services, redirecting skills that had once been used for harassment toward positive community building. The mentoring program that Derek had established paired young veterans struggling with civilian integration with elderly service members who had successfully navigated similar challenges, creating support networks that reduced isolation while honoring the wisdom and experience of older veterans. The program's success had led to replication in communities throughout the region, with Derek serving as a consultant for implementation efforts. Mike Brooks joined the gathering in his role as regional coordinator for veteran employment services, his military background and experience with the incident having positioned him as a trusted intermediary between veteran job seekers and civilian employers. His understanding of both military culture and the challenges of civilian integration had made him particularly effective in creating employment opportunities for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The job placement program that Mike had developed emphasized matching veterans' military skills with civilian employment opportunities while providing employers with education about the value that military personnel brought to their organizations. The program's success rates exceeded industry standards, with participating employers reporting higher retention and performance levels among veteran employees. Mike's advocacy for veteran hiring preferences and workplace accommodations had influenced regional employment policies while building relationships between military communities and civilian businesses that benefited both groups. His ability to translate military experience into civilian terms had helped hundreds of veterans find meaningful employment while educating employers about the capabilities and dedication that military service developed. Captain Robert Hayes made his monthly visit to the diner in his continuing role as liaison between federal agencies and the local community, his responsibility for managing the ongoing security implications of Margaret's exposure having evolved into broader duties related to protecting retired special operations personnel nationwide. The lessons learned from the Pinewood Diner incident had informed policy changes that affected thousands of classified military retirees living in civilian communities. Hayes' development of protocols for managing exposure incidents had been adopted by intelligence agencies throughout the federal government, providing frameworks for balancing operational security requirements with the rights and needs of retired personnel living civilian lives. His emphasis on community integration rather than isolation had proven more effective in maintaining security while enabling meaningful civilian relationships. The training programs that Hayes had created for federal agents working with exposed classified personnel emphasized respect for individual choice and community connections, recognizing that heavy-handed security measures often created more problems than they solved. His approach had been influenced by Margaret's successful integration into her civilian community, and the positive response that her exposure had generated among local residents. Commander Patricia Brooks arrived for her quarterly assessment meeting with Margaret, their professional relationship having evolved into a friendship that honored both their shared service background and Margaret's current civilian status. Brooks' responsibility for monitoring the long-term effects of Margaret's exposure had revealed consistently positive outcomes that challenged traditional assumptions about the risks of publicity for classified personnel. The research that Brooks had conducted on veteran integration and community support had contributed to academic understanding of factors that promoted successful transitions from military to civilian life, with Margaret's experience serving as a case study in effective community building and identity management. The findings had influenced military retirement planning and transition support programs that served thousands of service members annually. Brooks' advocacy within military leadership for more flexible approaches to classified personnel management had resulted in policy changes that gave retired special operations personnel greater freedom to participate in civilian communities, while maintaining necessary security protections. Her argument that isolation increased rather than decreased security risks had been validated by the positive outcomes observed in Margaret's case. The annual recognition ceremony that had grown from the original incident brought together community members, veterans, military officials, and federal representatives to celebrate the positive changes that had emerged from what had initially appeared to be a crisis situation. The event had become a model for other communities seeking to honor veteran service while building stronger civilian-military relationships. Margaret's keynote address at the ceremony focused on themes of service, sacrifice, and the importance of community support in enabling veterans to successfully transition to civilian life while maintaining their commitment to serving others. Her ability to speak about these topics without revealing classified details had made her a sought-after speaker at events throughout the country. The scholarship recipients who were recognized at the ceremony represented the tangible impact of the fund established in Margaret's name, with their achievements demonstrating the potential that could be unlocked when military families received appropriate support for their educational goals. The diversity of their career aspirations reflected the broad impact that military values and experiences could have across civilian professions. Emily Chen stood to read her essay about her grandmother's influence on her understanding of service and courage, her words reflecting maturity beyond her years, as she articulated concepts about duty and sacrifice that many adults struggled to comprehend. Her decision to pursue a career in public service had been influenced by Margaret's example and the community response to her story. The essay that Emily read described her grandmother not as a warrior or hero in the traditional sense, but as someone who had quietly served her country and community throughout her life, with the dramatic incident at the diner representing only a brief moment when her capabilities had been publicly revealed. The perspective reflected Margaret's own emphasis on service as a way of life, rather than a collection of dramatic events. The standing ovation that followed Emily's presentation reflected the community's recognition of both Margaret's service and the continuing impact of her example on future generations, with her granddaughter's words serving as a bridge between the classified aspects of her military career and the public understanding of her character and values. The media coverage of the anniversary celebration emphasized the positive transformation that had occurred within the community and the broader lessons about respect for military service that had emerged from the incident, with journalists noting the remarkable resilience and grace that Margaret had demonstrated throughout the years of public attention that had followed her exposure. The documentary premiere that had been scheduled to coincide with the anniversary would bring Margaret's story to national audiences, with its focus on community response and veteran integration, providing viewers with insights into the challenges and opportunities that existed in building stronger relationships between civilian and military communities throughout the country. Margaret's final interview for the documentary had emphasized her hope that her story would encourage others to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating their neighbors and community members, recognizing that extraordinary capabilities and experiences often existed in forms that didn't announce themselves or seek recognition. The legacy of the Pinewood Diner incident continued to influence policy discussions, academic research, and community initiatives throughout the country, with Margaret's example serving as proof that exposure of classified personnel didn't necessarily result in security compromises or negative outcomes when handled with appropriate care and community support. The transformation of a simple harassment complaint into a catalyst for positive change in civilian-military relations represented the kind of unintended consequences that demonstrated the power of individual courage and community response in creating lasting social impact that extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence institutions and attitudes nationwide. The quiet dignity with which Margaret had handled both the original confrontation and its aftermath had provided millions of Americans with a model for responding to adversity while maintaining personal values and contributing to community well-being, her example inspiring others to consider how their own actions and attitudes might affect the veterans and military families living among them. In the end, the story of 5 bikers who learned not to judge a quiet grandmother had become something much larger than a cautionary tale about assumptions and consequences, evolving into a reminder that heroism often wore ordinary clothes and that the strength to serve others was a quality that transcended rank, age, and public recognition to touch the hearts and minds of people who understood that freedom was protected by those who chose to serve in silence and anonymity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.